Welcome to a deep dive into the fascinating world of how our cells manage oxygen. We're calling this cellular oxygen homeostasis. It's pretty important stuff, right? Like survival and all that. And you've sent over some really interesting research that really dives into a kind of a less talked about side of things. It focuses on the repression of certain pathways. It's almost like sometimes survival depends on what you turn off, not just what you turn on.
Yeah, that's a really great way to put it. We tend to think of cells as, responding to signals by activating stuff. But there's this whole other level of control going on through repression.
So it's almost like there's this hidden control system making sure things are running smoothly, especially when oxygen levels get low. To set the stage for us, can you give us a quick explanation of hypoxia and why it actually matters so much to our cells?
Okay, so hypoxia, that's just a fancy word for oxygen deprivation. And it matters because our cells need a constant supply of oxygen. Without enough, they really struggle to produce energy, and they can eventually die.
Makes sense. So that's where these HIFs or hypoxia-inducible factors come in. What role do they play in this whole oxygen balancing act?
Think of HIFs like the master regulators of how a cell responds to hypoxia. When oxygen levels drop, they trigger a whole cascade of changes to help the cell adapt.
So they're like the emergency response team.
Yeah.
But here's where things get really interesting with your research. It focuses on the repressive role of HIFs. Usually we think about HIFs as turning genes on, but they can actually turn them off too.
Yeah, exactly. That's a really crucial part of the story. While HIFs activate genes that help cells survive with less oxygen, they also repress certain pathways. It's a kind of a strategic retreat, shutting down non-essential processes to conserve energy. It's almost like forcing the cells to switch from a high-performance mode to a survival mode.
Like trading in your gas guzzler for a fuel-efficient car when gas is scarce. In your research, you outlined 3 ways HIFs achieve this repression. Can you walk us through each one?
Okay, so first up, we have what's called transcriptional repression. This is where HIFs, even though they are activators themselves, can indirectly shut down the expression of certain genes.
Hold on, how do they do that?
They act through intermediaries. HIFs control these other factors that actually bind directly to the DNA and block specific genes from being expressed.
So they're not actually turning off the genes directly, but they're manipulating the middle management to do it for them.
Clever. What's the second method?
Okay, the second one is competition for cofactors. Think of it like this. There are these limited resources. Many processes in the cell, they need these helper molecules called cofactors. But when oxygen is low, HIFs, they come in and basically hog these cofactors. So those other processes are left empty-handed.
Ah, so like
Whoa.
someone taking all the supplies for a group project.
Yeah.
And that effectively shuts down those other pathways.
Precisely. Now, the third mechanism is called epigenetic modification. Basically, HIFs put a do not disturb sign on specific genes and stop them from being read. So they're not destroying the genes, they just silence them. That's incredible control. But why go through all this trouble? Why is repressing certain pathways so important for survival?
That's the key question. This is really the rubber meets the road for you, the listener. Why should you care about HIF repression? The answer lies in the really profound biological implications.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's start with metabolism. How does HIF repression affect how cells process energy when oxygen is limited?
So during hypoxia, cells are essentially facing an energy crisis. And HIFs help them adapt by shutting down those energy-hungry processes that rely on oxygen. It's almost like switching to a backup generator when the main power goes out.
So they prioritize efficiency over high output.
Exactly. This shift in metabolism is absolutely essential for survival under those low oxygen conditions. Another area impacted is cell proliferation. That's just a fancy way of saying how cells grow and divide. By repressing certain growth pathways, HIFs basically hit the pause button on cell division.
Like knowing when to conserve your strength and wait for a better opportunity. But we also know that HIF repression can have a darker side, especially when it comes to cancer.
That's right. While it's beneficial for normal cells, this ability to repress growth pathways can be exploited by cancer cells.
Oh, how so?
Well, remember how HIFs can silence genes involved in cell death? This can be a real problem in cancer cells. By repressing those death pathways, HIFs can inadvertently help cancer cells evade destruction. It's like giving them an invisibility cloak so they can hide from the body's defenses.
That's a sobering thought. A protective mechanism actually backfiring. Now, this research comes from a blog post titled HIF Repressed Pathways, an insight into cellular oxygen homeostasis, published by Epigenetic. The author, Tareem Ali, holds a master's in bioinformatics, and it was published fairly recently on January 22nd, 2024.
That's correct. So this is some pretty recent work.
Now, you mentioned metabolism and cell growth as areas affected by HIF repression. Are there other implications? Maybe something related to the immune system?
Absolutely. Immune cells also need to be able to function properly in low oxygen environments. Imagine they're trying to fight off an infection in an area where oxygen is limited. HIFs, in their attempt to, conserve energy and promote survival, might repress certain immune pathways.
That doesn't sound good. Would that weaken the immune response?
It's a delicate balance. On the one hand, repressing certain immune functions can actually help immune cells survive those tough conditions. But on the other hand, excessive repression could also hinder their ability to fight infections effectively.
So like trying to fight with one hand tied behind your back.
Exactly. This whole interplay between HIF repression and the immune response is a hot area of research. It has implications for a ton of diseases like cancer and autoimmune disorders.
It's incredible how much complexity there is within our cells.
It really is, and it really highlights why scientific exploration is so vital. The deeper we delve, the better we understand how our bodies function both in health and disease.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the potential for therapeutic interventions. So if we know how HIFs repress certain pathways, could we manipulate that process for therapeutic benefit?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one that researchers are actively pursuing. Imagine selectively blocking HIFs from repressing certain pathways in cancer cells. We might be able to make those cells more vulnerable to treatment, maybe even trigger their self-destruction.
That would be revolutionary. Are there any specific examples of that being explored right now?
Absolutely. Researchers are developing drugs that inhibit HIF's ability to bind to DNA. By blocking this, we can prevent them from repressing genes that promote cell death, essentially making those cancer cells more susceptible to therapy.
So instead of trying to directly kill the cancer cells, we're sort of disarming their defenses and letting the body take over.
Precisely. This is just one example of how understanding HIF repression is opening up new possibilities for cancer treatment.
It's amazing to think that cellular oxygen regulation could be the key to treating such a complex disease. We've covered a lot of ground already in this first part of our deep dive. We've explored those mechanisms of HIF repression, implications for metabolism, cell survival, even the immune response. And we've even touched upon some potential therapeutic applications.
We've laid a solid foundation for understanding the complexities of this crucial cellular process.
Indeed. But before we move on to part 2 of our deep dive, what stands out to you as the most significant aspect of HIF repression?
I think for me, it's the duality of its role. This process can be both beneficial and potentially detrimental. It all depends on the context. It really highlights the delicate balance within these biological systems.
I agree. Biology is rarely black and white. It's full of shades of gray.
Exactly. And this understanding is absolutely crucial as we move forward in our quest to develop new therapies and improve human health.
Well, we've reached the end of part 1 of our deep dive into HIF repression. In part 2, we'll explore the specific pathways targeted by HIF repression. We'll also delve deeper into the implications for various diseases, including cancer. Stay tuned.
Welcome back. Ready for part 2 of our deep dive into HIF repression?
Absolutely. In part 1, we talked about the basics. Now let's get down to the specifics. What are some of the pathways that HIFs actually target?
So remember we talked about HIFs acting like a dimmer switch. They're fine-tuning those cellular responses by turning some pathways down, not completely off.
Yeah, like adjusting the volume to just the right level.
Exactly. One of the key pathways that HIFs often dim is the cell cycle.
The cell cycle, that's how cells divide and multiply, right?
Exactly. And it makes sense that HIFs would want to kind of repress this during hypoxia. Why waste all that energy on growth when resources are already scarce?
It's like hitting the pause button on a construction project when materials run low. You conserve resources and wait for a better time.
Precisely. And this repression of the cell cycle, it's actually really important for preventing uncontrolled cell growth, which can lead to things like tumor formation.
So in this case, HIF repression is actually protective. It's preventing cells from dividing out of control.
It is. It's another great example of that duality of HIFs' role. They can be heroes or villains. It just depends on the context.
So fascinating. Are there other pathways that HIFs target to kind of keep that cell growth in check?
Absolutely. One pathway that often comes up in your research is the mTOR pathway.
mTOR. What does that stand for?
It stands for mechanistic target of rapamycin. But in simple terms, it's a key signaling pathway that regulates things like cell growth, metabolism, and even survival.
So it's basically involved in all the big decisions a cell has to make. Grow, divide, conserve energy.
Exactly. And HIFs can influence these decisions by repressing that mTOR pathway during hypoxia.
That makes a lot of sense. Why bother investing in growth when you're barely surviving?
Exactly. By repressing MTR, HIFs are shifting that cell's focus towards survival. They're promoting energy conservation and stress resistance.
Like switching from a growth mindset to a survival mindset.
Exactly. And that can be really critical for cells that are facing those really tough conditions, like what you would find in a tumor or during inflammation.
Speaking of tumors, you mentioned earlier that HIF repression can be a double-edged sword when it comes to cancer. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Okay, so while repressing cell growth can be beneficial for normal cells, it can actually help cancer cells evade destruction.
Right, it's like giving them a shield.
Exactly. By repressing pathways like the cell cycle and MTOR, HIFs can actually inadvertently protect those cancer cells from the body's defenses, and even from some cancer therapies.
So it's a survival tactic that backfires in a way.
That's exactly right. And that's one of the main reasons why researchers are so interested in understanding HIF repression. They want to figure out how it can be manipulated to actually help us in treating diseases.
Okay, so beyond just cell growth, are there other pathways that HIF repression might influence in diseases?
Absolutely. One that's really important to talk about is angiogenesis.
Angiogenesis, that rings a bell.
It's the process of forming new blood vessels. It's crucial for tumor growth because tumors need a constant supply of nutrients and oxygen to keep growing.
So it's like building supply lines to fuel that tumor's growth.
A perfect analogy. And HIFs can actually repress angiogenesis under certain conditions.
Really? I thought HIFs were all about helping cells survive with low oxygen. Wouldn't they want to encourage blood vessel formation to bring in more oxygen?
Yeah, it does seem kind of counterintuitive, but sometimes repressing angiogenesis is actually a way to conserve energy, especially when oxygen levels are extremely low.
It's like recognizing that building more roads won't help if there's no fuel to transport.
Exactly. And this repression of angiogenesis can actually be beneficial in some cases, particularly in cancer.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, by blocking the formation of those new blood vessels, we can basically starve the tumors and prevent them from growing.
Wow, that's incredible. So HIF repression, which we've been talking about as this complex double-edged sword, could actually be harnessed to fight cancer.
That's the hope. And it's a big reason why researchers are so excited about understanding HIF regulation. And you know what it could mean for new therapeutic interventions.
It's almost like we've discovered this secret weapon,
Right.
one that was already present within our cells.
That's a powerful image. It really highlights how important it is to explore all facets of these biological processes, even the ones that seem kind of counterintuitive at first.
I totally agree. It's a reminder that biology is full of surprises, and that groundbreaking discoveries often lie in those unexpected places.
Well said. Now let's talk about another really crucial aspect of cellular function that HIF repression plays a role in: metabolism.
Metabolism. We touched on this briefly in part 1, but I'm really excited to kind of dive deeper. How does HIF repression impact the way that cells process energy?
Okay, so it's a fascinating interplay. Remember, during hypoxia, cells are basically facing an energy crisis. They need to adapt their metabolism to survive.
Right, like switching to that backup generator when the power goes out.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. And HIF repression, it plays a key role in actually orchestrating this metabolic shift.
So how does it work?
Well, one way HIFs do this is by repressing pathways that really rely on oxygen, like oxidative phosphorylation.
Oxidative phosphorylation.
It's basically the process where cells generate energy using oxygen in the mitochondria, often called the powerhouses of the cell.
So that's the main energy production pathway when oxygen is plentiful.
Exactly. But when oxygen is scarce, HIFs come in and say, hold on, we need to conserve energy here. Let's dial down that oxygen guzzling process.
It's like turning down the thermostat to save energy during a cold snap.
Precisely.
Right.
And by repressing oxidative phosphorylation, HIFs shift the cell towards a more anaerobic metabolism.
Anaerobic meaning without oxygen.
Exactly. This anaerobic metabolism, it's not as efficient at generating energy, but it's a really crucial survival mechanism when oxygen is limited.
It's like switching to a lower gear to navigate a steep hill. You might not be going as fast, but you'll make it to the top.
A perfect analogy. And that metabolic shift orchestrated by HIF repression, it's essential for cells to adapt and survive.
It's incredible how much control HIFs have over the cell's energy production.
Yeah, it really is a testament to their role as these master regulators. And it highlights just how interconnected all these different cellular processes are.
Absolutely. Oxygen levels, gene expression, metabolism, cell growth, angiogenesis. It's all connected.
Exactly. Understanding those connections is crucial if we want to really unravel the complexities of human health and disease.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground in this part of our deep dive. We've explored how HIF repression targets specific pathways, things like the cell cycle, mTOR, angiogenesis, and metabolism. And we've seen how this repression can have both beneficial and potentially harmful effects.
We've also seen how these insights are actually paving the way for new therapies, particularly in the fight against cancer.
It's been a fascinating journey so far. But there's still more to explore.
Indeed. In part 3 of our deep dive, we're going to delve into the broader implications of HIF repression for a whole bunch of different diseases. And we're going to encourage you to ponder the impact of this cellular process on human health.
Sounds great. I can't wait. Welcome back to our deep dive. It's the final part. We've explored the mechanisms, the pathways affected, and even, peeked into the potential for new therapies.
Now we arrive at this really fascinating intersection where scientific advancement meets the broader impact of this research.
We've talked about HIF repression and its role in cancer, the immune system, even metabolism. Where else does this process have a major impact?
One area that's particularly interesting is cardiovascular disease. Remember how HIFs can repress angiogenesis, that formation of new blood vessels?
Right, and we talked about how that can actually be beneficial in cancer, essentially starving those tumors.
Exactly. But in cardiovascular disease, if angiogenesis is impaired, that can actually make things worse.
That seems counterintuitive. Why would less blood vessel growth be a bad thing?
Well, imagine a situation where blood flow to the heart is restricted. Like what happens in coronary artery disease.
Okay, so the heart muscle isn't getting enough oxygen and nutrients.
Exactly. Normally, HIFs would kick in and try to promote angiogenesis to restore that blood flow. It's like building a detour around a blocked road.
Makes sense.
But if HIF repression is somehow dysregulated, that compensatory angiogenesis might be impaired and further damage the heart.
So in this case, HIF repression is actually hindering the body's natural repair mechanism.
Precisely. And this just highlights how the same process can have completely different effects depending on the situation.
It seems like every time we think we have an answer about HIF repression, we end up with even more questions.
That's the beauty of scientific exploration. It's a continuous journey of discovery.
Speaking of discoveries, what other conditions are linked to HIF repression?
Well beyond cardiovascular disease, HIF repression has been implicated in a bunch of different conditions. Things like inflammatory disorders, neurodegenerative diseases, even aging.
Wow. It's incredible how this one process can have such far-reaching effects.
It really speaks to how interconnected all of our biological systems are. And it really underscores how important it is to understand these fundamental mechanisms, like HIF repression.
Absolutely. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from the inner workings of cells to the potential for these groundbreaking new therapies.
We've seen how HIF repression can be both a protector and a potential threat. It all depends on the circumstances.
It's been a fascinating journey, and I think one of the most important takeaways here is that we're really just scratching the surface when it comes to understanding this complex process.
I agree. There's still so much more to learn about HIF repression and what it means for human health.
And for our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into HIF repression. We hope you've enjoyed exploring the hidden world of how our cells manage oxygen.
And we hope it sparked a curiosity in you to learn even more about the amazing world of science.
That's all for this deep dive. But remember, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.